Okay, we're back and we are in cognitive development during middle childhood. So between 6 and puberty, what kinds of changes can we expect? Well, as you recall from the previous stages of development, the child has already gone through the sensory motor stage, which was 0 to 2, and then the pre-operational stage, which might kind of overlap a little bit for children that are in the current middle childhood stage that we're talking about, because you'll notice that Piaget said that this stage would end on average between 6 or 7. So some children are still pre-operational while others are starting to move to the next stage of development, which is the concrete operational stage. During this period, children are starting to learn the rules of how the world works. So as long as the information is provided in a concrete way, they can understand how the world basically works in a logical way. They can apply logic to concrete events. One of the big acquisitions during this stage is the acquisition of conservation. In the previous stage, we saw a pre-operational child making incorrect judgments about how much water is in a cup and things like that because they were focused in on the wrong details. In the concrete operational stage, children recognize that the basic fundamental properties of a substance or a number or whatever is preserved, even though it may look different. And what's interesting is that there is a predictable sequence of skill acquisition. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time going over the order. Usually kids get number first. So here I have an example where you have 2 rows of items. Usually I use quarters when I do this demonstration. And you put, 6 in one row, 6 in the other, and you ask the child, is this the same number of quarters in each row? And after they agree that it's the same, and you spread out one of the rows so that it's longer now. A pre-operational child will think that the longer row has more, whereas a concrete operational child will recognize that it's countable. And that's one of the big advances that allows children to start applying logic, that there can't be more just because you spread it out, because I can still see that there's 6. So that's an important realization the children make, and that's the first sign that they're moving into concrete operations. Then there's length. Just because you've moved one ahead of the other, it doesn't make it longer. It just means that they're no longer lined up and equal in parallel. So what the child does in concrete operations is they recognize that 2 things can change at once, right? It may look longer, but then if we look at the other end of it, now it looks shorter. So we realize, wait a minute, it didn't actually change, you just moved it. Volume is usually next, and children start to recognize that even though the water line is different, the width might be different, or again, being able to recognize 2 dimensions at one time. So they start to lose that centration that was such a critical component of pre-operational thinking. Mass usually comes next, where they recognize that there's the same amount of Play-Doh, even though you squished it. Area comes after that, and area is a tricky one. I think us adults still struggle with area, so I'll give you an example of that in a little bit. But the idea that there's 6 square units of pasture, even if there's something in between the units, it's still 6 units of pasture. Weight generally comes after area, recognizing that the object continues to weigh the same amount, even if they look different, or one of them might be made out of a more dense material than the other. So, does a pound of feathers weigh the same amount as a pound of lead? And of course, the answer is yes, because they're both a pound. But a lot of times, pre-operational children will say no, because feathers are light, ignoring the fact that they're both a pound. Concrete operational children start to recognize that the weight stays the same. And then volume is the last thing. The volume in this kind of setup is usually the last thing to develop. And what you're noticing here in the volume is that they're dropping something into the water to make the water level rise. And so it takes a little extra time for children to recognize that water displacement does not make more water. So it's a variation on volume, but it's a slightly different one. And that's usually the last thing. Okay, so those are the stages of skill acquisition in conservation in the concrete operational stage. Something else, as you guys recall from early childhood when we discussed morality, is the idea that it might evolve in stages. here we have Freud again and his psychoanalytic theory, and he thought that during the preoperational stage, he called it the genital stage. The phallic stage. Sorry, I got my stages mixed up. He called it the phallic stage, when kids are focused on trying to figure out which gender they are, which sex they are. And he said that, if you recall, kids go through that Oedipal complex where they fall in love with their opposite sex parent and want to kill their same-sex parent. The thing that resolves it, according to Freud, is castration anxiety. The fear that the parent is going to find out what the child has been thinking about and want to retaliate by castrating the child, removing their genitals entirely. He did also mention that children might be motivated by fear of rejection by their parents during the stage, so that if they express what they're really thinking or really motivated by, their parents might be horrified and reject them. Because of these fears, Freud says that children are motivated to internalize their parents' moral messages and internalize their parents' values so that they can bring themselves into alignment with what their parents like and value, so that the parents won't punish them and retaliate and castrate them or reject them or whatever. He says that this internalization allows them, the children, to avoid a feeling, those feelings of anxiety that are generated by these fears. It also helps for girls in particular to help alleviate the guilt that Freud thought that girls carried with us. I say us because apparently me too, all of us. He said that girls feel like they've already been castrated because, according to Freud, children of this age, prior to puberty, don't realize that there are, well, certainly prior to the age of 7, don't realize that, some people are born with external genitalia and some people are born with internal genitalia, and that to be a person with internals means that you are a girl, rather than, he thinks children make the mistaken assumption that everybody's born with external genitals and some of us were really bad and we've been castrated, and so we're already coping with guilt over that. And then whether you're boy or girl, you have guilt over those impulses to want to kill your same-sex parent. And so that makes us feel guilty. And so to overcome those feelings, Freud thought we would identify with our parents' values and morals, and that would cause us to, that way it makes us feel better. We don't have to feel as anxious or guilty. Okay. Kind of hard to explain his theory because, whatever, right? So anyhow, moving on to something else. Cognitive learning theory, in its explanation of moral development. According to this theory, we learn that some behaviors are good in some situations. Like, for example, prescription pain medication is good when dad's had shoulder surgery and otherwise he'd be experiencing pain. So it's okay. The doctor prescribed it. You got it at the pharmacy. Okay, I can see where taking drugs, I said that in quotation marks, is okay. It's good. And then maybe bad in others, the neighbor kid on the corner who has been, stealing people's oxycodone or whatever and selling it on the corner. So kids start to learn that, the very same thing might be good in one situation and bad in another. Prior to this, kids were very much good or bad. Like, people who smoke are bad because smoking's bad. And in the middle childhood period, they start to be aware that, okay, there can be nuances. Things can be good or they can be bad. It depends on the context. Piaget, if you recall from early childhood, had thought that we go through, two main stages of moral development. He thought, the early childhood is filled with heteronymous morality, where we are really dependent on the guidance that we get from other people, and that as little kids, you can't really expect us to have self-control. That, here we have a little a child saying, "Mom, the cat knocked the vase over," when clearly the kid is the one who broke the vase, right? Heteronymous morality causes us to be dependent on what the feedback that we get from other people or the guidance that we get from other people to keep us, in doing the right thing. By about age 8, Piaget said the typical child will start to move into more autonomous morality, where they start to do the right thing because it's the right thing, and they start to have self-control. And you can trust them to, when they're alone, do the right thing things like that. And so he thought prior to the age of 8, it was really important for adults to provide that moral compass for children, and that we really are setting them up for failure if, when they're younger than that, we put them in situations and expect them to make the right decision on their own. He said, really, you can't expect that till they're older. So by the time they're 8, one of the things that drives children to be more autonomous is that they start to realize, fairness and, cooperation. They start to be able to put themselves in the other person's position and realize, well, I don't like it when somebody doesn't give me a turn. So the right thing to do would be to let other people have a turn, even though I want to be the only one who swings for the entire recess. I have to give somebody else a turn. So they start to realize those things. And Piaget thought it was super important for kids to be around people. I'm struggling with the right word because it doesn't have to be people of your exact same age, but kids, other children, because with adults will oftentimes roll over and let the kids have all the fun or eat the good stuff or whatever, because adults realize, well, you're a kid and we can always get more, or we could do it again later, and kids can't necessarily realize that. And so parents oftentimes and adults will oftentimes let kids have like more self-centered things going on than other kids will allow. Other kids are like, hey, wait a minute, I want to turn. Hey, wait a minute, I want to bite at that. Things like that. And so the fact that they're equals makes them stand up for themselves more. It also causes them to internalize the reasons and the rationale behind why you should behave in a fair way or do the right thing, not cheat, things like that. So by age 8, we're starting to see what you would consider true self-control, where they really are internalizing lessons and really starting to make a decision on their own how to behave. Now, Kohlberg, if you recall him, he was a student of Piaget's, and he thought, like Piaget, that we go through stages of development that are based on cognition and based on brain development. But he tried to apply that to, our burgeoning moral compass. So if you recall from early childhood, pre-conventional children are first off worried about just avoiding punishment. And then in the second stage, they're really concerned about seeking rewards. By middle childhood, kids are starting to move into what Kohlberg called the conventional level. And it's important to remember convention means rule or law. Sort of like standard norms is another way of saying convention. So kids move into this next stage when they start to realize there are rules, there are laws, and then also they start to realize, they want to fit in with their peers and they want to be approved by their peers. So in stage 3, the motivation to do the right thing would be because they want to be a good person. They really want to please others. So a lot of times they've moved past seeking a reward. Well, maybe we could say that the reward becomes feeling like they're a good person, getting feedback from other people that other people are happy with their behavior. They say thank you, or they say what a good child you are, things like that. So stage 3, they're really motivated by being a good person and pleasing others. Stage 4 starts to move into more just strict law and order, following the rules because they're the rules. So I picked this image off the internet because we've got, a child doing their homework and the other child peeking, right? And so at the first stage, when we talk about stage 3, being a good person, it might be that the child who's peeking might stop doing that behavior if the child who's doing her own work says, don't copy my homework, I worked hard for this, and you should do your own work, right? It's not fair to be cheating off of me. A child who's at the stage 3 level of morality will be impacted by their peers telling them, I don't approve of what you're doing. So I want, the motivation as a conventional level person is to, please other people. And then also that I'm a good person part. Like I don't want to be labeled a cheater. I don't want to be labeled a person who does my own work. So that motivation can drive the kid who's peeking to realize, okay, I shouldn't be doing that. That's wrong. Stage 4, law and order. If the child who's doing her own work said that's against the rules for you to be cheating, that would be a very stage 4 morality argument. That it's not, I'm going to tell the teacher is another law and order kind of thing, because the teacher will come in and invoke the rule that you're not allowed to copy. So stage 4 is very much based on rules and laws. So a stage 4 child might say to their parent, the speed limit says 35 and you're doing 40. You're breaking the law. They're very concerned about rules and laws and things like that during this stage. Now, the thing that's kind of wonky about kids during this conventional level, because this is going to expand into adolescence, and kids are oftentimes going to be more concerned about the laws and rules of their peer group than they might be concerned about the laws and the rules of society at large. So whereas society might say that the posted speed limit is 35, a teenager might say, well, more important to me is that I've got peers in the car and they're teasing me for driving like grandma if I do the speed limit, and so therefore I'm going to speed, right? So they know what the law is, but they're much more concerned about the law among their peers. So this law and order phase doesn't mean that they're necessarily always doing what larger society would approve of. So this conventional level reasoning is very typical from about age 8 through most of adolescence, and for some of us, we never really fully leave the conventional level. We may never really reach the post-conventional. So we'll talk about that more as we continue aging. All right. Cognitive styles. So we don't all think the same way. We have, in psychology, identified a few themes and, ways of thinking that really you can separate people into. One that's really noticeable in the middle school years is the impulsive style versus the reflective style. Some people are really ready to give an answer, even if they're not entirely, they maybe didn't even fully hear the question and they're ready to give an answer. They just want to be fast, they want to get it out, they want to answer. Whereas some people really reflect and really think about their answers before they provide them. One of my best examples of impulsive versus reflective comes from when I was a young adult and I was visiting my uncle, who he was a college professor, but he was in the botany program at the University of Arizona, and he was stationed off in a field station in Yuma, Arizona. So he spent a lot of time with just sort of his plants and his grad students and things like that. And his job, I thought this was really interesting. Being a psychologist, this seems like such an interesting thing that he did. His job was to try and figure out how to splice on rootstock that was resistant to disease and that was drought tolerant onto citrus trees, and then splice on branches and things like that would be insect resistant and produce fruit that was juicy and these kinds of things. It's amazing. He spent his entire career trying to make the perfect lemon. But anyway, we were playing Pictionary, and it was my husband and I versus my uncle and aunt. And so, no, my grandma and grandpa were there too. So there were 3 people per group. So it was me and my husband and my uncle versus my grandma, my grandpa, and my aunt. Okay, so we're all playing Pictionary. And if you've ever played Pictionary, right, there's a timer and you have to draw the picture and your team has to guess what the picture is. And we altered it. We didn't have, we didn't play on the board or anything. All we did was sort of just draw the pictures, and whoever guessed fastest, that team won. So we want to win, right? So my uncle is in charge of drawing. And he looks at the card, he sits and he thinks for a second. Okay, it seemed like a really long time. And my husband and I are yelling, draw something, draw a line, anything. And then we started guessing polar bear in a snowstorm. I mean, he wasn't drawing anything. Finally, he just very deliberately and very precisely, sketches out whatever the clue was. And we instantly guessed it because he did such a good job with it. But I thought, man, that is an excellent example of a reflective thinker. He literally thought about it before providing an answer. And he was like that in verbal responses too. He would think before he answered, as opposed to me, who answers and then thinks about it a little bit more. I just had an interaction just this very morning when somebody told me something. I reacted to what I thought they said, and then we had to spend some amount of time backtracking to figure out what they actually meant, and maybe I should have been a little more reflective. People have differing styles, right? Some people are impulsive and some are more reflective. Another style difference is between the field-dependent and the field-independent people. I got this picture. When I was a kid, this used to be in the comics. You guys might not know what comics are because they're very antiquated. But in the comics, you would be told, you'd be shown this picture and you'd be told that, for example, you need to find the sailboat that's embedded in the picture, or you need to find the lips that are embedded in the picture, or the heart, or whatever. And so like there'd be a list on the bottom of all the little things that you're supposed to find, and then you're supposed to look around a hidden figure. It's a pretty fun game for little kids to play, right? So basically, there's this element that you're looking for in the field, right? People who are field dependent have a very difficult time finding the elements that are within a field. People who are field independent do a great job of finding the elements and have a really hard time processing the entire picture. So some people say that it's the person who can't see the trees for the forest, where they're so busy seeing the big picture that they can't see the trees. And then there's the reverse, where I'm so busy studying this one tree, I don't even realize I'm in a forest. People who are field dependent very much are influenceable by context. People who are field independent are much more likely to be influenced by individual things like thoughts in their own head, things like that. One of the ways that we measure it in psychology is you can see on the left, you can see the three-dimensional cube that's sketched on the left, and you're supposed to find that object embedded in the picture on the right. You can see the person's already marked it out. So we can test field dependence, and it turns out that people who score on the field dependent side are people who are a little bit more influenceable by peer pressure. They're a little bit more likely to, sort of seek consensus before thinking about their own solution to a problem. People who are field independent oftentimes have difficulty working in groups. They really don't want to merge ideas as much. So it's like different styles. There's not one that's good and one that's bad. There's just different styles. And same thing with impulsive versus reflective. A lot of times the impulsive person will get their answer out and they'll be right. Whereas the reflective person sometimes gets overlooked because they are taking their time and they had a right answer, but they didn't impulsively throw their hand in the air. So children sometimes who are reflective get overlooked. Sometimes people who are field independent are very uncomfortable in collaborative group work, who, and vice versa. There's pros and there's cons, and there are just these different ways of thinking about things that may persist with us for the rest of our lives. And then that brings the last topic I want to talk about, which is creativity. Creativity is defined as generating original and useful responses. Now, a lot of times when you think about creativity, you might think about painting or making music or something like that. But cognitive creativity can include those things, but also could be solutions to problems. You're coming up with solutions that maybe nobody else has thought about. It turns out that you don't have to have high intelligence to be a creative person. In fact, some research has shown that the ideal sweet spot for intelligence and creativity is to be between about 85, which is the low end of average, and 120. That's like the sweet spot for increasing creativity. If you're much higher than 120, a lot of times what you find is that you've got a person who's really good at finding the one right answer to problems, which kind of interferes with being able to solve a problem creatively. They can't think of lots of answers to a problem. And if you're significantly below 85, your creativity might be hindered just by the general difficulty that the person has with verbal skills or spatial skills or other things that are causing that lower IQ. So somewhere between about 85 and 120 seems to be the sweet spot. Now, something that's kind of interesting that I've been exploring recently is how formal education may actually interfere with developing creativity. I've actually posted in our classroom, in the campus classroom, a link to a video about creativity and formal education, and how all of us being trained to think in the same way actually makes it much more difficult for us to actually think of something that's not what everybody else has done. So it may inhibit creativity. We all find out how to do math and find the one right problem, answer to the problem, but then we can't think of things like, in the video he talks about all the different things that you could do with a paperclip. And as we age and get more and more educated, we can think of fewer and fewer things to do with paperclip. And that's a stupid, meaningless example because, unless you're in a situation where you need something that you could make out of a paperclip, it probably doesn't really matter. But it's an analogy for solving problems in general. So it's a really interesting video. So if you take a few seconds and watch it, it's a really interesting video. All right, well, that concludes my discussion of cognitive development in middle childhood. So I will see you back here for psychosocial development.